We're going to get started now. My name is Daniel Tishner. I am one of the co-directors of the Wayne Moore Center. On behalf of our entire team, I'm delighted to welcome you to this Defending Democracy series event, and thank you for being here. So this event would not be possible without support from contributors from our Wayne Moore Circle. I also want to thank two key partners, Dean Juan Carlos Maeda of the School of Journalism and Communications, and the student-led University of Oregon chapter of the United Nations Association. So please join me in thanking all of these folks. So before we jump in, let me just lay out what the game plan is. For the first 15 minutes, our featured guest, Ben Rhodes, will offer some remarks to situate the conversation. Then we will shift into a panel discussion for 40 minutes, and then we'll have audience Q&A. To save time, you all have received this printout for our amazing team of panelists to engage with Ben. With one change, Yvonne Braun unfortunately isn't feeling well, so we have the able pinch hitter tonight is my co-director, Rebecca Dinwiddie. So we have a great team. The impressive student who will be introducing Ben Rhodes is Dana Rubesh, who is president of the UO's chapter of the United Nations Association. Dana is a third-year student at the Clark Honors College, majoring in global studies with minors in legal studies, Spanish, and Middle Eastern and North African studies. Dana considers themselves to be a global citizen, having grown up across 6 different countries. They hope to pursue a career in international human rights. And Dana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am so delighted to introduce our featured guest for today's event, Ben Rhodes. Rhodes is a widely acclaimed writer, political commentator, and national security analyst. He is the author of 2 important New York Times bestsellers published in the last decade. One is After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made, and the second is The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. Ben Rhodes also is a co-host of Pod Save the World, a popular weekly podcast on international news and foreign policy that, as it promises, doesn't feel like homework. Rhodes is also a contributor for MSNBC, and his work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Foreign Affairs. From 2009 to 2017, Rhodes served as a speechwriter and deputy national security advisor to President Obama. In that capacity, he participated in all of the President Obama's key decisions, oversaw the president's national security communications and public diplomacy, and led the secret negotiations with the Cuban government that resulted in an effort to normalize relationships between the United States and Cuba. Prior to serving for the Obama campaign and administration, Rhodes worked as an advisor and speechwriter for the president of the Wilson Center and former Congressman Lee Hamilton. Rhodes continues to serve as a senior advisor for former President Barack Obama and is chair of National Security Action, a political non-governmental organization committed to restoring principled American leadership at home and abroad. Please welcome me in joining Ben Rhodes to the University of Oregon.
Thank you, Dana. And before Ben jumps up, I also forgot to mention 2 quick things. If you notice on your program, if you want to text questions that are going to come later, the phone number is up there, or if that font's too small, it's right behind me. And the other quick thing is we have a QR code if you want to help support events like this. Thank you. Ben.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Dana, again for that. And thank you all for being here. I already had a great discussion with a group of students. This feels like this setup could be a talk show or could end with me in prison. But I like it. I like it. And I do want to say it's an important time, I think, for people to come together like this. And normally we'd be coming together maybe to talk about a certain region of the world or a policy. But I think we're kind of at a moment where we just are trying to figure out what's happening. and why it's happening and what it might mean. And so I, by way of introduction, was just going to offer some kind of thoughts about where we are, how we got here, and where we might be going. And then in this discussion, I think we should go anywhere you guys obviously want to go on policy, foreign policy, politics. But I think this is a good moment for us all to be very open in terms of just trying to understand things. So I was just going to try to begin by saying, I want you to consider just a few things that have happened in the last couple weeks, right? And in the 2 hours that I haven't been looking at my phone, I don't know what other things have happened. But I was just going to highlight 4 seemingly random and distinct things that have gone on the last few weeks. So one is the U.S. government freezing all foreign assistance, despite that not really being legal in terms of Congress ceding its prerogatives. A second is, if you've been following, the rebel group M23, a very brutal rebel group, has kind of stormed into the city in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, seized that city, clashed with UN peacekeepers, and it's a resource-rich environment. They obviously have their designs on those resources. A third thing is, I live in Los Angeles. We've been dealing with wildfires there, wildfires that are self-evidently caused by climate change. Rain brings more vegetation, dry summers bring drier vegetation, and the winds start the fires. And yet, we've also had the U.S. withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement in the last couple of weeks. And then the last thing, seemingly unrelated, is China announcing that they have a new AI chatbot, DeepSeek, that seems to be pretty much the same as OpenAI's chatbot, GPT, as long as you don't ask it about Tiananmen Square. And that happened the same week that Sam Altman announced a $500 billion investment in AI in this country to build something that the Chinese built for a few $1 million. But so like a lot in the news today, these things may seem unrelated, but I want to kind of make the case to frame this discussion that they're all actually quite connected, because they're all basically an outcome of an unraveling that has been taking place for 15 years in terms of the international order that has essentially governed, with huge blind spots, but essentially tried to govern the behavior of nations since World War II, and an unraveling of democratic norms in this country and commitment to a certain national and global role for the U.S. government. And that those two things, the international order unraveling and the domestic kind of concept of the U.S. government unraveling, I think are connected. And the freezing of aid highlights the U.S. walking away from global responsibilities. The situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo reflects the failure of an international system to prevent that, even with UN peacekeepers there. Again, the wildfires in LA, demonstrate how far behind we are on global climate action, reinforced by the Paris Agreement pullout. And then those competitive announcements from the US and China on the technology that is going to be deployed in the world in the next 4 years, those highlight the extent to which there is absolutely no discussion between the US and China about managing how AI may change our economies and our lives, which would normally be something that big powers negotiate. So all these things are kind of symptoms of this absence of regular order. So again, how do we get here, which I'll try to do quickly here. Look, it's tempting for Democrats, and I'm one, to kind of attribute this to Trump. This is Donald Trump, this is the chaos he's brought, but I have felt for a long time and feel even stronger today that's the wrong way to look at it, that he's as much a symptom as a cause of this world we're in. And as I've tried to think about the US and the global security picture, which is where I worked for 8 years in the White House, this has been building for a long time. This kind of lack of confidence in the U.S. leadership of a certain kind of international order in this country and around the world. And just during my life in politics, I'd point to the invasion of Iraq and the excesses of the war on terror, which really kind of upset confidence that Americans had that these people knew what they were doing, who sat in offices like the ones I sat in, and rattled confidence around the world that the Americans kind of could be trusted to be stewards of international order. But it also kind of offered this framework that was useful for Russia and China to say, well, those guys aren't following the rules. Why do we have to follow the rules in terms of what we do at home or what we do in other countries? And in Russia, Putin set out to essentially dismantle the international order, most notably through his invasion of Ukraine. In China, Xi Jinping, very importantly, shifted China's strategy, which had always been, since Deng Xiaoping opened up China in the 70s, to kind of draft behind the US and play by the rules and kind of quietly grow their economy. Under Xi Jinping, that shifted to China saying, we're going to start to opt out of this US-led international order, and we're going to start build our own, with our own relationships and our own institutions and our own ideological system. And in that context, and we had people here who were in the UN Association, the UN can't work to solve a problem, even one like the Democratic Republic of Congo that seems not on a front burner in terms of geopolitical rivalry, because it's only as functional as its member states, its most powerful member states, allow it to be. And similarly, if the biggest powers in the world say, well, we're not going to play by the rules that everybody else has to play by, it incentivizes nobody to play by the rules. And just speaking personally, when you spend a year and a half giving unconditional military assistance to the Israeli government to do things in Gaza that are completely outside the bounds of international rules, you are reinforcing that dynamic. So that's what's kind of been happening internationally and building for a while, but it's similarly important to look at what's been happening within our democracies. And here I felt, when I was in government, and feel even stronger today, that the 2008 financial crisis was this kind of pivot point in terms of politics, because the degree of that collapse in this country, and even more so in some cases in Europe, it upset the whole basic premise of post-Cold War globalization, which was, there's a lot of stuff people don't like because there's a kind of homogenization of culture. Traditional identities feel like they're disappearing in this kind of new age of globalism, but things are getting better economically, your standards of living are rising, it's a good deal. So you might not like everything, but in the end, it's better for you than not. Well, the financial crisis became this moment when the bottom fell out, on top of what had been a process of deindustrialization in this country in particular. And I think that confidence in elites and institutions was broken. And interestingly, it did not lead to a manifestation of a backlash on the economic left, which is what you might have thought after the financial crisis caused by financial elites. That was captured on the populist right by leaders who saw that they could kind of marshal the oldest form of politics, which is nationalism and traditional identity politics, to kind of build a coalition of people that were angry at a system that had failed and that felt like it was not nationalist, it felt globalist. And obviously Trump kind of steps into this current of right-wing politics globally and leverages it. And what we see is a playbook that has been pursued in a lot of countries. It was first described to me by a friend in Hungary about 6 or 7 years ago when I asked him how Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, was able to transfer that country from a liberal democracy to an autocracy. And he said, well, that's simple. You win election by harnessing grievances at the globalization and failure of the financial crisis. Then you redraw parliamentary districts to entrench your party in power. You change voting laws to make it easier for your supporters to vote and harder for your opponents to vote. You kind of start demonizing and harassing civil society. You pack the courts with kind of right-wing judges who find in favor of your power grabs. You enrich some cronies through corruption, Those cronies then finance your politics. You have those cronies buy up a bunch of media outlets, newspapers, television stations, and turn them into kind of propaganda outlets. And then you use social media to spread misinformation and disinformation and to harass your opponents and to kind of radicalize your own supporters. And you just wrap it all up in an us versus them message. Us, the real Hungarians or real Americans or real Russians against them, the immigrants, the globalists, the Muslims, the LGBT people, George Soros. And that's the playbook. And so that sounded familiar to me, even as he was describing Hungary. And it's important to note now, we're not at the beginning of that playbook. Like, we're actually closer to the end of that playbook. And then the last kind of wild card that has shaped this world is technology and the explosion of kind of unregulated social media, which accelerated every one of these trends because it was able to be a perfect tool of either surveillance and control, if you have a kind of Chinese Communist Party mindset of things, or the propagation of information, disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theory, and just negativity in general with the precision of an algorithm that can polarize a society. And so that kind of takes us to where we are. I'll just say a few things to kind of point forward a bit here. I think it therefore important to look at Trump, and who's made a lot of the critiques of the global system that I would have made, but obviously has vastly different remedies than I would pursue, and kind of understand the basic concept that in the first Trump term, a lot of Democrats, and myself included, I think said, well, this guy's an aberration. He's a break from the norms and practices of our country and from the international order that has existed for decades. But now, as we hit the second term, I think what we have to recognize is he's actually the norm in the world today, and the status quo in the world today. He can present as a radical disruptor, but actually think of how familiar he is in the world today. He's a right-wing nationalist at a time when that brand of nationalism is ascendant everywhere. He's a strong man, full of a world of strong men, and they're all men, mostly in their 70s. And so and he's kind of a corrupt transactional guy in a late stage capitalist moment that's kind of how the global economy works. And so this is what's going on in the world. There's nothing that unusual in most places about a self-interested autocrat who surrounds himself with some oligarchs and weaponizes the justice system and the military and allows his cronies to get rich. Like, that's not abnormal. What's abnormal is that being the kind of electorally mandated approach to the United States of America, right? So that's where we are. And while, again, I think Trump's critique of where globalization went wrong and where certain aspects of foreign policy went wrong have some merit, his answers, I just think, take us in the wrong direction. That's just my view, and I don't claim to have all the answers here, but tariffs could exacerbate inflation, mass deportations obviously will threaten kind of social cohesion in this country and also drive up inflation. Tax cuts, deregulation, federal embrace of cryptocurrencies, these are not ways to kind of redress inequality. Obviously abandoning action on climate change or regulation of AI, I think has its own dangers, and this kind of territorial expansionism in Greenland and Panama, and I don't think Canada, but we'll see. It worries me in the sense that it's taking place in a world where there's already been a kind of normalization of territorial seizure, whether you look at Ukraine, whether you look at the West Bank, whether you look at Taiwan, whether you look at the DRC today. And when you combine nationalism with that kind of aggression combined with an absence of rules, like we're kind of all the way back, 100 years, right? Kind of pre-World War I stuff. Now, that's where we are. So all of us have to recognize that, and look, there may be people who are glad we're there, right? I think we have to recognize we live in a country where at least half the country is glad we're there. And in the world, there are a lot of people that are glad we're in this place. I'll just say about going forward a couple of things. The first point that I think we need to bear in mind is that there's like a fundamental connection, and this is why I kind of framed the discussion like I did, between what is happening inside all of our countries and what is happening globally. That this idea that we have a conversation about politics in this country, and then we have a conversation about policy in this country, and then there's this kind of nerdy conversation that happens about foreign policy. No, like foreign policy in the world today is entirely an extension of what is happening inside of the politics of countries. So there are things that I think I would recommend we be doing on an international basis right now, which is essentially saying, and I'm saying this about both domestic politics in this country and internationally, a hurricane has come through, that means that you rebuild. And there actually is opportunity in that, right? There's opportunity to say we're not just trying to tinker around the edges, we're going to negotiate an entirely new international order to actually reflect how the world looks in the 2020s, which is very different than how the world looked in the 40s and 50s or 90s when the international order as it exists was negotiated. And for me, you have to avoid conflict, so you need to start to have formulas to manage and resolve disputes in the places I talked about. But I also look at issues like climate change and a coordinated clean energy transition globally instead of a fractured one. AI, and how do you manage the deployment of these technologies in a way that minimizes risk, optimizes what can work well, brings the rest of the world into it so you don't have a huge inequality in the application of these technologies. Nuclear weapons, where people may not be following, but our country is on track to spend $2 trillion modernizing our nuclear arsenal. So if Doge wants to look for a place to get a little savings, like that's one place to go. But that's a part of a picture in which China's investing in nuclear weapons in a way they never have before, and Russia's investing in it. I think that's a bad thing. And so how do you begin to negotiate a kind of updated nuclear regime? How do you manage the flow of people, which, whether people like it or not, is not going to get any better with climate effects? So there are the issues that cry out for this kind of international construction of an order that's kind of negotiated between the US and China and Europe and a number of other important countries from every region in the world. But that is going to, not going to happen, I think, until there's a kind of regeneration of politics in this country that is different than what it is now and different than what it was when I was there or when Joe Biden was there, that finds a way to remove, to some extent, identity from the centrality of these debates we've been having. Because when it's all about identity, it feels existential and it's more divisive, and it leads to kind of all or nothing sense of swinging back and forth between administrations. And that, I think importantly, develops both a brand of politics and a set of policies that is responsive to the way people are living now in this country, which I think the Democratic Party, for a lot of good policies that it did not always do. This is not, and I don't think any of this is Washington-based. I think for the next couple of years, I speak as a Democrat, it's a time to do things at a local level, at a state level, in terms of trying new political and policy approaches, seeing what works, seeing what you want to nationalize, seeing what another generation of leadership looks like, as there's going to be a clear passing of the torch now that the old guard is gone. And there's real opportunity and hope in that, in the sense that you can build something in this country that can also interact with the global dynamic that is different, and that is more reflective of the world that young people from places like this university are going to go into. So that's kind of where my head's at. Let's try to understand this thing we're living in, because we don't choose the times we live in, they choose us, and we live in interesting times. But then having understood that, how do you begin to try to apply that to a rebuild, not a renovation, of both American democracy and an order around the world that can hold? So with that, I'm ready to be grilled, guys. I'm ready to do whatever you want.
You very effectively covered a wealth of topics and issues, and I just appreciate how you did that so skillfully. Our panelists have come up with a few questions to ask you, and we're not going to have time for all of us to ask all of our questions, but kind of based on what you've been talking about, I invite our panelists to go with the question that you want to go with after that. And Story?
Thank you. So the title of this event is Conflict and Chaos, and that along
I tried to live up to the title.
that along with your opening remarks paint quite a pessimistic future of the world. So I'm wondering if there's any place that you think is going to be more peaceful in the coming year than was in 2024.
I just also want to say, I come not to offer false hope. I think it's difficult out there. It's dark out there. But I also think there's never been, we're always kind of measuring the present against some time when we thought, it's been pretty messy for a while, and it was messy before that. And I mean, this is just a uniquely uncertain moment in some ways because it's a transitional moment. Like a certain world of politics and geopolitics no longer exists. And so the first point is, I am, yes, I'm pessimistic about certain things, but I also think that there's not a perfect period in human history, and there are kind of these wrenching periods of transition. I think, and I'll say this in a way that is not people in my line of work don't usually say, we're living in a declining empire, right? And that's always a little messy, and you kind of often get like a Trump, who's like, I don't like this. I want to go back to when we could tell everybody what to do, and actually the fights he's picking are interesting. Colombia, Denmark, Greenland, it's like the bully walks out onto the schoolyard and looks around for like a small kid to just feel tough again, right? Notice those China tariffs, we're waiting on those. They will come though, but so and also the pendulum can swing like really fast. I mean, way back when I was getting involved, things seemed pretty dark after 2004. Republicans had a whole government. George Bush had somehow won re-election despite the Iraq War. People were really angry at how inept the Democrats were, and they had no idea how to do anything or deliver a message. And 4 years later, Barack Obama won the biggest landslide since Lyndon Johnson, and we had 60 senators. So I mean, the pendulum can swing. That's the hopeful part that I want to just kind of caveat the pessimism about. I was so focused on that I forgot the second part of your question.
There's one place in the world that you think is going to be more peaceful. I really, the places that, well, I mean, if I were to be specific, I guess I'd say India can navigate this world pretty well because they kind of pivot around. I think Southeast Asia has managed to insulate itself to some extent from a lot of global conflict and just focus on development. And that's, so I those would be places that I expect to see normalcy. Then because I'm going quickly, in Latin America, I would have said, a couple of weeks ago that that is a region with a fairly stable trajectory. But honestly, this Panama stuff and the kind of weird out of the gate focus on Colombia made me wonder, maybe that's not the case. At least the case for the possibility of political disruption seems higher. And then if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, where there are pockets, there are places that have had like some good development of late. But I think between Sudan and the DRC and North Africa, where there were a number of coups, it kind of leaves you just parts of Southern Africa and East Africa trying to kind of insulate themselves from these trends. And then I think Europe is got a lot of uncertainty. So it's basically that part of the developing world that has managed to insulate itself from some of the forces I was talking about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So you've talked about being in an era kind of marked by a new global oligarchical class, whose focus seems really increasingly driven by profits, getting off this planet, and consolidating political power.
If only.
If only, right?
Yeah. I mean, we can all agree on that, right?
If that trend persists in their involvement in politics, whether that's Elon Musk in Germany or even in our own country, what does this spell for global governance going forward?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you could spend a whole day on why American politics got this messed up. I would argue, if I had to point to one thing, it'd be the Citizens United decision in 2009, which removed any limitations on political donations or dark political donations. And it kind of created this, oligarchization of American politics, because suddenly you can give unlimited money and buy influence, and it's a straight line from the Citizens United decision to that murderer's row at the inauguration, where you've got Elon and Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg and Sundar, and I guess Jeff Bezos' second wife, or maybe, well, no comment. But also, I think it's important for Americans to understand that this is totally normal in the rest of the world, or not all of it, but Russia, Eastern Europe, post-Cold War economies always had these kind of oligarchs who would function. There are parts of Southeast Asia and parts of Central Asia this is how things function. I only make the point that what's depressing for me as someone who worked in foreign policy is like if Americans were looking from the outside in at this, they'd be like, oh, wow, like, what an oligarchy, and we scoff at Putin and his oligarchs, but this is the exact same thing, happening here. And actually, to me, it's like more alarming because, not just because we're the United States, but because these people control technologies that are vastly influential in the lives of billions of people around the world. And so if there's some oligarch in Russia who owns like a lot of oil rights, or there's some construction magnate, in Hungary who's a billionaire, that's like, as a political science proposition, a bad thing, but it's not like somebody who controls Starlink or Facebook or Google or is building artificial intelligence that in the next 4 years will likely reach the point at which it knows how to do things that human beings don't know how to do. Like that's what I'd actually be most focused on, if there are things I was worried about. And I think that whatever politics emerges in this country in opposition to that, so as a Democrat, what I think the Democratic Party literally should be designed to be in opposition to that. That the populism that the Democratic Party needs to embrace, because it's both an economic populism. We don't want to live in a country where 100 trillionaires, essentially almost, are writing the rules and writing the tax code and self-regulating. That's bad. But we also don't want to live in a political system where people like that are able to have this much influence. And so it's both an economic and a kind of government reform message about what the system should work for and who it should work for and how it should work. Because this is just an unbelievable concentration of power. I'd just say one other thing that I try to work into. I think the thing that people are not watching enough is that what is happening with cryptocurrencies. The easy point is that Trump is making more money than the U.S. president's ever made by launching dubious financial instruments. But the broader point, as someone who's followed crypto for a long time, is the whole premise is that governments are going to be bad bets. Governments are going to be unstable. The idea that you need a piece of paper, a currency backed by a government to have value is actually the wrong bet, because the world is headed towards a chaotic future where we won't be able to trust that, and so we want to have another kind of currency, right? And it's not a conspiracy theory, but if you're simultaneously completely deregulating the crypto industry, that was just the largest single industry donor in this campaign cycle, with a president who is going to be creating chaos in international financial markets and undermining the kind of basic US-backed dollar global system, the people invested in crypto are going to make a lot of money. And again, I think you can make that argument without it being a conspiracy theory because it's happening, and so I actually think this is so important that it would actually be, to me, the organizing, and I'm very humble in saying I don't have the answers, but if I was at the meeting of the people trying to figure out where the Democratic Party goes, I would say, like, working outwards from that platform at the inauguration is what's wrong with everything. And what is the policy agenda that deals with that is how I would actually argue you should start.
Gosh, Ben, I thought I wasn't depressed enough.
I keep trying to find these little ways to be hopeful, and yeah.
So one thing I'm thinking, given this kind of the crumbling of democracies everywhere in the world, I wonder if the way we are thinking of democracy as will of the people, the rule of the demos, and maybe it's too moralistic, and what's happening behind it is that it's allowing, in the name of the people, to actually to destroy and damage democratic institutions in the name, because you have the public mandate, you can do anything you want. So I wonder if we need to bring back another discourse of agonistic democracy, which is, that the democracy is based on government and opposition, and that divide is important because you don't want adversaries to become enemies. And there is no democracy possible where there is this opposition or divide doesn't exist. If you don't have an opposition, you really don't have a democracy. So I wonder if we, instead of using the moral ideas that can be actually misused and communicate, I wonder if we can start thinking of democracy and democratic institutions a little differently.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because part of what makes this challenging is I could look at the current situation and be like, and it's interesting, I've been doing this book that is kind of all of American history, and so if you go back to, Benjamin Franklin has this quote that I'm not going to do directly, but at the end of the Constitutional Convention, his warning about autocracy is that the people will only have despotism in this country when the people themselves are so corrupted that they will insist on despotism. It's a little, haunting. But I could look at what I was just describing as kind of, that inauguration and say, that's a certain danger of majoritarian populism, right? People get kind of off the rails a bit, and technology's radicalizing them, and then you get this kind of 50.1%, or maybe not even, obviously, majoritarianism where suddenly there's no opposition. But at the same time, weirdly, that majoritarianism that is populist in demeanor is in service of a very entrenched power structure, right? And that is, kind of a corporate or techno-corporate set of elites in this country. So you're right that essentially what we need to start to be, where I think the Democrats really, were wrong in their messaging at least, because they were limited in some of their capacity to pass things, is they became completely defenders of institutions, and people are pissed at those institutions. And as someone who's worked in politics, like if you are defending the thing that everybody's mad at, like we're defending the federal government, we're defending, the deep state, we're defending the idea of democracy and the institutions of democracy. That's actually the losing end of the argument, even if morally you believe in those things. And where I agree with you is you should actually be defending how you want things to be working. Like how can we make the government both, as you said, and you're right. I think we have to kind of start making an argument, and this is why I made the point about like getting identity out of things, but making an argument of like I think people are a little tired of everything being political. Like I'd like to be able to, root for an athlete without knowing, who they voted for in the last election. But and I think a lot of people feel this way, and it's kind of like, can we just take some things out of politics and get back to politics being a back and forth about how things should be governed and not about like who's American and who decides that? And so I think you're right, like in terms of, and we were just talking about norms, but in terms of being for a way that the system should work and how politics should be practiced in this country, rather than being for like just a set of institutions, I think that's a really good way of thinking about things. But I also do think that you have to reckon with some of these structural issues. And look, if you can marshal enough, if a populist energy, I actually think you can start to go after oligarchy. I mean, there's a right-left convergence that can happen on that. So I think you have to both kind of be for the way things should work, but can we kind of do some plumbing here on the institutions a bit in the same way?
So the folks here in Eugene and at this law school they like to dig their hands in the dirt and make change and respond to crises. And what are folks supposed to be doing right now is my main question, because I hear what the Democratic Party should be doing. And, as a former lawyer in a law school, I would like to think that we can depend on the laws, but the law doesn't have an army backing it up to enforce itself. So that question combined with this sense, like you referred to, of every minute or every couple of hours, it's something new. Some crazy thing that Trump or the folks like him put out, and we swivel our heads and we try to respond because real people's lives are affected, and then it's the next thing. So how do we organize our lives as community and people who want to make things better and stay sane if possible? And I know you have answers for sure.
Yeah, I don't, like, I preface everything with like, we should all have some humility that none of us has the answers, right? And I'm just, these are just some thoughts that may be right or may be wrong, right? And I guess how I'd frame this is there's what we do individually on a kind of almost a personal basis, which is not something I would normally be talking about at a venue like this, but I think that's kind of where we are. And then what we are doing, on a community and more political basis. And I say that because I think on a personal basis, and whatever, by the way, even if you're a MAGA, but especially if you're not, I think it's a time to really like step back and give some real thought to, what am I, what kind of society am I in, and why? How did I end up in it? And to be a little more specific about that, anytime I look at a certain kind of autocracy in another country, there's like a very concerted effort that is usually made to make you think, to make you be cynical or apathetic, to make you think that nothing matters or that nothing can change, And so I want to think about, like, what am I allowing myself to participate in that seems designed to make me feel those things? So for instance, the people I just talked about, the Naggers, this is maybe not the place to get your information all the time. You know what I mean? And even if you think you're on like a friendly algorithm high, that you're still participating in the dynamic. And I'm not saying we all have to just all go off into the rural woods here, but I mean, like, just talk to people more about things. Try to find different sources of information. Kind of think through, how do I consider my place in the society? Where do I get my information? Who am I interacting with? I know that seems kind of unusual but I really think that you ask yourself how you would have been in certain periods of history, like, how can I prevent myself from not thinking for myself? Like, I actually think that's something we all have to consider right now, because there's so much that is designed to make you not think for yourself. I mean, like, literally, most of the platforms on which we get most of our information are actually literally designed to algorithmically make us think a certain way, And even if we think that that is reinforcing our convictions, it's actually making us participants in something that has resulted in this. So that's that first thing of just kind of going back to the basics of how do I organize my thinking. And then I think as a community, look, there are people that are going to be vulnerable, and there are people that need to be thinking about how to help vulnerable people. But I think more broadly, getting mad about everything that happens every 2 hours is not what to do. Thinking we can make fun of it is also not what to do. I think this is, again, a rebuild, and what is, I think, hopeful, and what there should be opportunity in is this is the time to innovate on policy, on politics. If things are a blank slate, how would you change them from how they were before, not just from how they are with Trump? And so whether you're in a city or at a state or in a university, this is the time to kind of blue sky things and to regenerate what democracy is going to look like, and to give yourself, and it's really not just for Democrats. By the way, if you're a Republican, Trump, he's 78 and he's kind of a one of one. The Republicans don't know what they're going to be after Trump either, frankly. So I think, across the board, there is this kind of space for something that has not happened in this country in a very long time, which is a kind of total rethink of what are the policies, ideas, and brands of politics that can deal with this world. Because again, like, we're going to be deep in MAGA for 4 years, but whether you're MAGA or non-MAGA Republican or Democrat or independent, we have no idea what's going to come after that, because I don't think Trump's going to be in office, after that, and there's not an error in that party to him. There's these different factions that only he papers over, and the Democrats are literally a teardown, But again, I say that with that's a good thing, right? Like, we can actually, things were broken clearly, and so let's think about how to, like, have a better outcome on the other end.
I think you could do a mic drop right there. But I do know that folks out in the audience have questions and on live stream. And I just want to check with my panelists. Do any of you have one question based on...
I'll be quicker on my answers, too. I'm sorry.
Anyone? One question?
Going to the DRC real quick. When the Obama administration was in power, when M23 last took over Goma, the city that they've just taken over now, but they left it pretty quick. Can you explain why that happened and what the Trump administration might learn from what happened in 2012?
Well, yeah, I mean, what happened was essentially, you have a regional strategy in Africa, and then you have an international strategy that involves the United Nations. And so right away we started working with not just the authorities in the DRC because they're very weak, but you bring in Rwanda, which obviously has a huge responsibility here for the M23, South Africa, Kenya. We worked with kind of neighboring states, Burundi. So you try to begin to get some consensus regionally. This is going in the wrong direction. You're also telling the Rwandans, we know what you're doing, But then you go to the UN, and you get a kind of UN Security Council meeting. You get a UN Security Council mandate for international support for, the UN essentially filling the gap that had been exploited by the M23. You get some peacekeeping presence. You have kind of structured dialogue to address certain issues. And so that there's a fairly routinized playbook that has not worked in solving a lot of these problems, but does work in preventing them from getting much worse. And I think that's very important actually. Sometimes that's the best you can do. And yeah, I don't see the Trump, the UN is not going to be where they go for this kind of thing. So I guess he could call Kagame, the president of Rwanda, and try to, I don't know, threaten him with tariffs. Seriously, I assume their approach will be more transactional and bilateral than multilateral. And what they're probably not concerned about the humanitarian situation, which they should be. But there's a massive natural resource component to this that they probably do care about.
Charles,
if I might,
Yep.
definitely piggybacks off that. So I grew up in rural Oregon, and I think it's interesting. A lot of Oregon represents a lot of the America that we see in the polls, right? And how do you bridge the gap between Eugene and the DRC? How do you bridge the gap between this America First mindset that kind of permeates even throughout this state that's considered blue, and what is happening halfway across the world?
So this is a really interesting question because, again, 3 years ago, and even on my podcast this week, I made this case of here's why it matters, right? And it matters in a humanitarian perspective because, horrific war crimes are and could be committed, but it also has these other, the flow of people. This could lead to hundreds of thousands of displaced people, if not millions. We've seen how that can destabilize neighboring countries, also create migration pressures in places like Europe. Could also be destabilizing, therefore, to the global economy. So you paint this picture that this affects your interests in some bank shot way. I realize now that may be the wrong way of thinking about it, because I actually think you want Americans to care about a place like the DRC. The people who do tend to get there either through a policy interest or a religious interest or a humanitarian interest, and it's very hard to reach other people. But I think what we need, the way in which we need to reconceptualize it, is that we need to become the kind of country that cares about what's happening in the DRC. So it's less about going to Americans and being like, let me make you an intellectual argument about why you should care about this. That's actually a hard thing to ask someone in rural Oregon or in Eugene. But if we're doing the right things here, we would care about it because we wouldn't want to see millions of lives be put at risk, and we'd want to do something about it. And there have been times in American history where we had a politics that produced a government that was never perfect, and that did, every presidency has some black mark on it, but generally, it was just assumed by Americans that you would want to do this. I mean, I remember feeling that even when first Obama year, the Haiti earthquake happens. And sure, we could say, we better go help these people or else there'll be, migration, But actually, no, it was just kind of well, we better help these people. Because that looks really bad, And that mentality doesn't exist right now. And so that's why we have to see this more about as an us issue than a policy or world issue.
Great. So we are now going to transition to questions from you folks. And just to explain what we have going on, like I said before, we have a huge list, Ian just showed me, of texted questions. And then I'll get my Fitbit steps by trying to alternate questions between each section. Okay, so go ahead and raise your hand and I'll come find you, and Ian's going to get us started with a texted question.
Okay, I'm just going to read this texted question. So, hi Ben, texting in from Austin, Texas, as an Oregon alumni and a Wayne Moore scholar. My question to you is, so often the reason the U.S. is able to be a global bully is because smaller countries need us more than we need them. But does that only work on an individual country basis? Is it possible that all our allies and neighbors who are challenging decide to join together and divest from the U.S. and take care of each other in such a way that makes them much less dependent on us and weaken our power? Or is our military power always going to make us untouchable?
I think that there's a version of yes, in the sense that I think that smaller countries are going to band together. And they're also going to shop around, right? So if I'm Colombia, and that just happened to me, I'm not going to not make changes. I'm going to go to Brazil and Chile and Mexico and be like, hey, we better all start to figure out how to, America-proof our economies a little bit more, probably increase trade and supply chains within Latin America. Oh, by the way, if we need a major supplier of X, or we want to sell our natural resources to Y, we're going to call the Chinese first, not the Americans. And we also maybe want to get closer to Europe. So I think that's going to happen, but it's not going to happen like overnight. And part of what's dumb about American politics, it's like, what a win for Trump. The Colombians are taking military planes instead of civilian planes. Is your life better because that happened? But the cost to it is going to play out over time. So it's not going to be a new international organization in 2 months. But I think in 4 years, we're going to look up and there's going to be this kind of reallocation of relationships and power and around the world. That said, the U.S. is such a big, predominant military force and large economy and technological superpower that they can't. There's limits to how far that can go. But just going some of the way with that means a very different world. So the U.S. will always have some capacity to throw its weight around. I just think a world with less friends and where people are kind of scared into doing business with us is not one that is a sustainable pathway to U.S. leadership.
And I'm about to hand off the mic, but if you've been staying the whole time, there's 2 seats right here, 2 seats right there, so don't be bashful. Come on down and get a seat if you'd like. And the other thing I'll say is when I hand over the mic, please don't give me paragraphs. Quick questions so we can get a lot of people in. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, Ben, thanks a lot. That was really a good introduction you gave. It seems to me World War I and World War II were a time where people were focused on not, get off my lawn, me first. And then that led to an era after World War II of an era of the United Nations of cooperation, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, global trade, ... There was a whole bunch of cooperation that's happened during my whole lifetime. I was born in the 50s, and I'm lucky to have lived in that area of global cooperation. Now that's collapsing. We're moving back to, not just in the United States, but all over the world, an era of get off my lawn, me first. It sounds similar to what we had in World War I, World War II. Does it take an economic collapse, a global collapse, to get back to collective altruism?
Yeah.
As it did in the early 1900s?
I honestly think if we can avoid global conflagration, I'm actually kind of optimistic that none of these movements have some deep ideological roots, like say communism or even fascism in Europe in the early 20th century. And so I think they will exhaust themselves in their incapacity to solve problems, which will allow for some shift in global politics. The problem is, can we get there without there being a world war or a massive global economic collapse? I mean, that to me is the question that concerns me. And actually, I would say we probably can't, but it's a big difference as whether it's an economic shock or a world war, right? Which is what it took to get the nice world that we got to grow up in. And I would say, you can find evidence for both cases on the conflict piece, because on the one hand, we all, if you look at where World War I and World War II are, it was, Europe, East Asia, Middle East, North Africa. Well, we're kind of 2/3, into that, right? Ukraine is kind of this hot war in Europe. The Middle East is, beyond Gaza, there's just been a lot of violence in the Middle East, and it could draw on Iran in a kind of state conflict way that would be different. And then Taiwan is sitting right there, right? So that's the case for alarmism. But on the flip side, there's not yet any indication that any of the, I don't feel great about the fact that the people that will make this decision in the next 4 years are Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump, and Bibi Netanyahu. Not the 4 guys I would maybe you could throw in the supreme leader of Iran. Not the 5 guys I would want to be making those calls. But actually none of them, none of them has suggested in any way that they want the global conflagration. That could change, or something could happen, like a Taiwan contingency that gets out of hand, right? There's also a rest of the world that is more powerful, and I think one of the underappreciated things is that in South Asia with India, in Southeast Asia with ASEAN, and Turkey, and Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, these are increasingly important countries that the big powers also care about. And so nobody wants to be so bad that they piss off the whole rest of the world. Now Trump may test that proposition. So there's actually some guardrails around conflict being more than this kind of already alarming regionalized dynamic. But the economic thing feels like it's coming already. I mean, there's something that just feels unsustainable about the fiscal circumstance in this country, the levels of inequality, the introduction of new financial products like crypto, and again, that could be very painful. But I would take a big recession that sobers some people up and swings the pendulum back over the alternatives. So in some ways, and then maybe I'm wrong about everything. Maybe Trump is right, and we're in a new golden age, and everything's gonna be great. In which case, we get great, it's fine. I'm not optimistic about that, but so I do think some kind of, and COVID turned out to be exactly the wrong global conflagration, because it seemed to exacerbate all the negativity and nationalism that people were feeling. So in some ways, an economic shock, is a risk, because sometimes that radicalizes people. But also, it may be a thing that swings the pendulum back, and I think we're in for one in any case in the next 4 years of some dimension. It might not be even as big as 2008, but there's some bubble that will burst.
Okay, this is somewhat related to the answer you just gave, but it seems that proxy wars between larger powers may be in vogue again. Where might you see a new proxy war develop in the near future between a U.S./China/Russia? What's the next 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact?
I mean, the Middle East is usually a place where proxy wars happen. But a lot depends, therefore, on how things unfold in the Middle East. Syria seems to be holding together, and that's a very positive development. That's progress. If there's an Iranian war, like a real, if the U.S. ends up in a military conflict with Iran, then I think you're looking at a massive proxy war over the future of an incredibly important, strategic, resource-rich place. I think that, in Europe, it's pretty clear where it's basically, there already is a proxy war between Russia and the U.S. and the EU. I guess Trump could scramble that because he may be on the side, because it's not just Ukraine, it's places like Serbia that has territorial claims. Hungary has territorial claims. You could start to see some strange, almost 90s feeling politics in Europe. Hopefully not with violence, but potentially. So that's not just Ukraine and not just like the Russian Baltic scenarios, but I kind of like Serbia is like a kind of place to watch to see if this kind of politics is spreading. And then I think in Asia, South Korea, with all the instability there, and with Trump being somewhat disinterested in it, there could be some, the Chinese may be trying to get more influence there, and then America won't like that. And so there's some places for this. But I also think that the biggest concern in some way, and in Africa there's all these competition over natural resources in places like the DRC. I think the bigger problem is connected to what I was saying with the DRC earlier, is that the break on that used to be, number one, like a system of, international system rooted in state sovereignty that kind of, you didn't push too hard in this direction. But number two was just the kind of basic humanity of like, we want to avoid, the indiscriminate killing of civilians or the large-scale loss of life or things that displace mass amounts of people. Part of what concerns me is the kind of fraying of, and again, with all the caveats that it was never perfect. And look, even at the height of when people thought this system was working, millions of people died in a conflict in the Congo and through the 90s and early aughts. So it's never been perfect. But when you look, this is where, we haven't mentioned this, but I'm just going to dive right in. When you look at Gaza, the idea that level of, all of Gaza was completely destroyed. And obviously October 7th was an absolutely horrifying abuse of violence and disregard for any normative behavior. At the same time, it's different when a state, backed by the most powerful state, destroys an entire place of 2 million people with total disregard to international law and opinion, and it's not that big a deal, and if anything, it's like, don't talk about that, right? And so that matters too, because it just, you start to get used to, you just start to get accustomed to, because I have people that argue with me about this. I'm sure everybody probably find 100 different views about Gaza in here. People say, well, what else are they going to do, and I'm like, well, not that, and that's why it just, we need to kind of recover some center here, because we are normalizing behaviors that should not be normalized.
Sorry to kind of, change this discussion to one about war, military stuff, but so a question sort of like that, with like Trump threatening our allies in Europe and threatening people with military force to use, as well as sort of receding from backing countries like Ukraine, or potentially receding from backing countries like Ukraine. How do you see that as potentially affecting things like nuclear proliferation? This is something I've thought a lot about and worried about. If you can't win a war, a conventional war against the United States, really, so you need an insurgency or you need some sort of weapon that we're too afraid of. So
I actually think, this nuclear issue kind of cries out for more attention, because what you have to understand is, yes, the international system was built after World War II to stop that from happening again, right? But most importantly, that system was basically built to avoid a nuclear war. Like, so the whole structure of it was kind of, how do we limit the number of countries that have nuclear weapons or might want nuclear weapons? And so, part of NATO's premise is, well, you're under the American nuclear security umbrella, or Japan, South Korea, you're under the American nuclear security umbrella. And hey, rest of the world, between the Americans and the Soviets, there is somebody for everybody, or there's a balance that you don't have to worry about this in terms of you needing nuclear weapons. And then after the Cold War, it was kind of a period where kind of U.S. rationality to some extent had to be trusted enough to kind of buttress non-proliferation. But that's gone, right? Not entirely, but I mean, that kind of, Trump is not deeply invested in the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So where I would get concerned is countries that feel, directly at risk by something that, they are in proximity to or could be the target of where this goes. So South Korea being like, wait a second, the North Koreans are never giving up their nuclear weapons. Trump is telling us we have to pay more to have the troops here. We should just, we're technologically capable. We'll just build a nuclear weapon. And Japan, well, then we need a nuclear weapon. The Chinese are building nuclear weapons. The South Koreans are getting nuclear. And then so suddenly you have this kind of nuclear Northeast Asia, that would concern me. And then, at a certain point, like, if that in Australia is like, well, we're usually left alone down here, but I mean, this is a little alarming. And so a regional dynamic in which it sets off a nuclear chain reaction, for lack of a better term. And so then you look at the Middle East and Iran. Well, the Saudis could buy a nuclear weapon whenever they feel like it, and so then the Middle East scenario is Iran, Saudi, Israel, and I guess the Emirates would defer to the Saudis, but maybe not. And so those two regions are the ones I'd be most alarmed about. I mean, I wouldn't expect it in Latin America. I wouldn't expect it in Sub-Saharan Africa at this point. I guess in Europe, if things got really hairy, like a Poland might say, hey, like, we nobody's a bigger fan of NATO than we are, but NATO's not looking so good, so maybe we need to do this. So, but weirdly, when I look at the world now, I think that the South Korea-Japan one, like, would be the sign of them just being like, we don't trust where this is going. I still think that's less likely than likely, but that's what I'd be looking at.
Okay. I'm curious to know your thoughts on the future of hostage diplomacy in the new administration. With many Americans being held around the globe, what is the outlook for getting people back, as well as deterrence in Trump 2.0?
So I worry a lot about this because this is an issue that has become an increasingly larger issue in some kind of strange symbiotic relationship with our politics. I remember in the Obama administration, because there are people that are taken hostage, in deeply political circumstances, right? Like, all the way back to the Iranian hostage crisis, or, ISIS trying to grab a journalist as a hostage, a terrorist organization. But in the Obama administration, there also started to be these kind of, the example I always give is there were 3 hikers. They were kind of young 20-something Americans who decided to hike along the Iraq-Iran border, which is not a good idea. And they crossed into Iran, and they were picked up by the Iranians, and they charged them as spies and everything. The way that should have gone is that's a really insane thing that those 3 people did, but they're definitely not spies. And let us just kind of quietly talk to the Iranians about this and be like, guys, these are not the droids you're looking for, But it became, the Republicans were like, the mullahs are humiliating Obama, and suddenly the price went up, right? Because this was a big political issue all of a sudden, and by the time then the Sultan of Oman ultimately got them out. We didn't ask how he did it. I'm sure it involved something, but then the point is, I felt over the course of it became a right-wing kind of obsession that anytime any American was in prison anywhere in the world, it was a sign of Obama's weakness. And that was so damaging because all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, this is great. Like we can really, if we want to get something, out of the Americans, we'll start to roll people up. And then weirdly, Trump makes it much worse because he loves these it's like he likes to have hostages that he can get out of prison. And the other countries are seeing this, and they're like, well, we'll grab somebody, and if it's, interestingly, if it's a friendly country, the United States, right? So if like Sweden arrests like ASAP Rocky, like we are ready to go to fucking war to get ASAP Rocky back, right? But if like an adversary of the United States grabs somebody, I'm telling you, this is happening under the table. And they're getting people back and spy swaps, or someone's paying somebody else to pay somebody. And it doesn't matter as long as Trump gets to welcome a plane home. And it doesn't solve any, if you're spending all this time on this issue, think of what you're not talking about with those countries, which is what those countries want. They'd rather be talking about 2 people in prison in Turkey than a bunch of other things, right? And then Biden, with the Russians, became a high art, like they've emptied Western prisons of Russian spies by, grabbing Brittany Griner and grabbing, and so I just think we've been on this site, like this sounds, I don't mean this in a callous way, quite the opposite. We need to be less publicly focused on this because we keep driving up the price. And I think Trump likes the kind of weird pageantry of it. And so I'd expect more of that dynamic. Maybe he'll be so full Trump this time that it actually will be a deterrent. But if you look at the pattern in the past, the more adversarial a nation is, who has an American hostage, like the more they get, which is a strange thing to think about in terms of whether that's in American interest.
So we have time for one more question, I'm afraid, and you get to have it.
So as someone who doesn't have a future in political activism or professional activism, anything like that, also feels like the immense responsibility to make the world better. How would you say someone like me, who's not directly fighting for a better future, can make a difference in my career, even if it's like an artist or a psychologist or something like that?
Okay. And do we want to package one more over here in red to gender balance out the last 2? You had your hand up, I saw. Yeah.
I can't see. Oh, okay. No, that's okay.
Thank you so much. I'm a first year.
Well, hold on 1 second. Because people can't hear you on live stream.
I'm a first-year history student. I just wanted to thank you because I think you brought me some optimism today, despite calling yourself a cynic. And I wanted to say that the pendulum metaphor specifically inspires me as a young person because there's an idea that we have a potential for making this better. But you also elucidate all the things that make swinging that pendulum so much harder. Trump's oligarchs controlling crypto, controlling the media, controlling the algorithms, controlling the wealth. And so I guess my question is, how do we swing it? Yeah. What do we do? And I know there's no magic, easy answer, but... Yeah. What directions should we be looking in?
Yeah. Okay, good. They connect, these questions, and they're a good place to end as well. So, first of all, I think that the failure of the Democratic Party, of which I'm a part, there was a kind of vibe to Resistance 1.0 that was like, this guy is an aberration, like we're here, like the Democratic Party, to be the fountainhead of the resistance, and what we're gonna ask people like you to do is to support us, and then if we win the next election, we can get Trump out of there, and we'll get a bunch of grown-ups back in, and then you guys won't have to worry so much about politics. And actually that worked for a bit. Democrats won the House in 2018, the huge groundswell of organization from younger people and concerned people across the country. Joe Biden in the pandemic election gets his win. But then what the Democratic Party never did is, then it was like, we're back in charge, we got Joe Biden here, he knows how to do deals on the Hill, we got some really good technocrats, you're not gonna believe how good these technocrats are, they can do wonderful things for you. and Trump must be discredited because of January 6th, and let's move on. And lo and behold, like, people were still pissed about a lot of things, including COVID. People didn't have somebody, even if you liked Joe Biden, he couldn't tell people what was going on, just literally. He couldn't kind of narrate. Part of the job of a president is to kind of narrate what is happening in the country, and we didn't have a narrator for 4 years. And so Trump, weirdly, was the biggest voice through that time. And then you had this massively cynical lack of a generational handoff. And it just started to look like these Democrats said they were trying to save democracy for all of us. Maybe they were just trying to save democracy for Joe Biden and these technocrats and Chuck Schumer and, you know, these people in Washington. And so we should not do that again. So, like, what I wouldn't ask is necessarily, well, even though I think it'd be great to support, I actually think people need to get much more community-oriented and locally focused in what do I care about, where don't try to fix everything or combat everything Trump does. Is there something happening in my community that I'm concerned about that I want to work on? Or do I see a politics developing in my community that I want to be part of? Or do I want to run for a certain office where I am? Or do I want to go to work on an issue that, you know, should become part of the platform of whatever party has the common sense to pick it up? But kind of following, I think we need a bottom-up regeneration, and as a Democrat, I'd say, of the Democratic Party. And the good news is that is happening, by the way. There are younger people in public office. I guarantee you, as someone who's been around Washington, like, the younger they get, even in Congress, tends to be better. You know, like, we've got some good people, you know, and actually that's why Democrats, you know, nationally tended to do better than the national ticket. But we could use a lot more. But even if you're not a Democrat, I mean, some of this is just about saying we've allowed, you know, the kind of body politic to get an illness, and to, you know, you need to fight that illness everywhere you are. And so if you want to get involved to make a difference, my answer is actually, what do you care about? Go make a difference about that. You know, if you care about climate change, if you care about immigration, if you care about justice, if you care about economic policy, if you care about the law, if you care, whatever the thing, if you care about, you know, land use, and if you care about housing, I mean, find an organization, find an effort, find some other people who care about that, find a politician who cares about that. Because, you know, if people are directing that kind of energy at solutions and coalition building, and people talking to one another about solutions, it will inevitably bleed into a congressional election cycle in 2 years. And then in 2 years, you know, we'll have a congressional election, and then, lo and behold, there's a whole new presidential election. And for the first time in the Democratic Party in the 21st century, there is no Joe Biden. There is no Hillary Clinton. There is no John Kerry or Al Gore. There's no, like, person that is the front runner, and this blank slate. And so I think what I'd like to see is that bottom-up energy. Now, it connects to the first question. As a matter of political strategy, but also as a matter of kind of national identity, I just think that we have a massive cultural issue, right? If I was speaking as a matter of political strategy as a Democrat, somehow, like, we have lost the thread on the culture, you know, like that it was, you know, there was something that felt artificial about, you know, Beyonce giving a speech at a Kamala rally, and Katy Perry and James Taylor playing concerts, and Bruce is out there again. And by the way, a lot of these people are old, and if they're young, it's kind of not exactly the young person you'd want out there. It's like, well, we got Katy Perry, not Chappell Roan, like, whatever. But like, at the end of the day, there was some real authentic culture that the Republicans had built, you know, with, like, the manosphere, and, you know, there's it's not my culture, but the point is, so, sure. So as a political strategy, I'm kind of like, well, we need to kind of I'd say progressives and people on the left, like there needs to be like a more authentic expression, and not one that is, by the way, meant to elect Democrats. You know what is not effective is when when it feels designed for that purpose. A lot of the really effective culture for the Republicans were people that had sports or other man interests, podcast or whatever, that then became attached to politics. So these people had real credibility because they didn't start talking to their audience about Trump. They talked about their audience about, I don't know, supplements or, the need for the patriarchy to come back or something, But on an interesting level, like I was struck by that there wasn't a lot of good culture in the first Trump term. Like I was like waiting for like the great movie or the, because I loved 70s movies growing up, and I'm like, where's the, Apocalypse Now or All the President's Men or the kind of paranoid film and then where's the, the music, or where's the 60s, right? Like where's that, and it kind of, instead it was like resistance, memes, and but so actually I think a culture that is not designed to like win an election, but a culture that is more directly responsive to what is going on, and that is critical of what is going on in its own way, on its own terms, is better than this kind of like, let's get some celebrities to be Democrats, and but I really mean this, and it kind of ends with a point I was making earlier of like, let's take this time to, again, for a lack of a better way of putting it, like think about who we want to be in the world, because individually, because I have a kafia like in the line site. I keep coming back to this kafia-ish. Like I would just like to live in a world where I look at someone in Gaza and I'm like kind of curious about that person, and would like to know what that person is like, and not see them as like a terrorist, that informs my view of that foreign policy. But when you get close, I'd also like to live in a world in which there's not a global conflict. But then when you get closer to home, it becomes about who am I giving my attention to, And this comes back to the phone. Like, how much attention do I want to give to Trump? Like, how much attention do I want to give to a social media platform that I know is owned by somebody that is designing that platform to profit off of me? So basic things like how do I want to spend my time? What do I want to choose to care about? Where do I want to get my information? How do I want to think? And also to challenge, people on the left, like getting curious about people that disagree with you, and trying to find some way to turn that into a conversation, instead of this kind of back and forth, because you don't out-troll trolls in the end. I mean, if people want that, they're going to go to the genuine article, And actually that, again, like that's where I think you kind of can be hopeful of like, wait a second, I don't need to follow any of this rule book, but am I contributing to this being the kind of community, country, and world I want to live in just some small way? Because if enough people do that, that's what begins to actually kind of change the character of things. And then that turns into organizing around certain things, or that turns into kind of new cultural movements that change politics, because that's usually where politics changes in this country, through culture, at least when it moves to the left. And then when the next, hopefully in 2 years or 4 years or whenever it happens, when better leaders come along, there's like something for them to plug into, in the same way that Trump plugged into the Tea Party, and so that I think is kind of, let's just kind of, we control our attention, our thinking, our thought, our action, and there are ways in which we can alter those things that will actually make you feel better and more mentally healthy, but also are the right things to change things. And I don't want to diminish, by the way, that there are people that don't have the luxury of going through the exercise I just described because they're immigrants or because they're vulnerable people or because they're transgender people. Like, there needs to be obviously support that is different for people that feel specifically vulnerable. But I actually think part of what we owe those people and in each other is what I've been talking about, is just trying to kind of find a way to detoxify ourselves in the process of detoxifying this country.
So thank you, panelists. Thank you for coming tonight, and have a great evening.